Today we are going to create a tier list for Stalker Corrupted Dungeons to guide players on what weapons you may want to consider when you're going Stalker Corrupted Dungeons. And this is specifically for Stalker Corrupted Dungeons. I am of the opinion that if you are trying to create a tier list, it has to be very, very, very specific. And today we're going to talk about Stalker Corrupted Dungeons. And we're going to go through all of the weapons. We're going to discuss some items more than the other because time. We're going to look at it per category. We're starting off with the Shapeshifters, the Arcanes, the Axes. We'll try to see how we can do this better. And if you're watching on YouTube right now, there should be a clickable link below to see per tree. Okay, let's do it. Let me explain my tier list. This is the S tier is where the meta resides. These are the weapons that you want to use in Corrupted Dungeons if you want to get a lot of wins. A tier is an okay alternative for the S tier. They can be really good. Let's do this super meta. Alternative meta. If I can type, there you go. Alternative meta. B, I would say is like barely usable. Barely usable in a sense that yes, you can use it, but you need to be really, really good to make it work. It's not part of the meta. It can get you a lot of wins, but you have to be really, really good at it and like practice it. C, I would say is like the cheese builds. The cheese builds are the ones where you don't necessarily win because you have higher damage or you have better gameplay. It's more of trying to trap your opponent, trying to stun them into lava, trying to bop them into lava. If you don't get those kinds of players who fall for that, you break. These are like the cheese builds, okay? It's not really for like brawling or kiting. It's just they need you to make a mistake for it to actually work. It's a meme build, basically, yes. And D is like, let's go with the don't use. Just don't use it. Stay away from it. Don't ever use it. Okay. There is this too, though. Barely usable plus and barely usable. I just want to create a distinction between the barely usable ones. Some are better than the other. So it's more difficult to be an expert with the barely usable. Barely usable plus, like, most players, if they practice, they can probably win significant number of their fights. But that is the category that we are looking at. Okay, let's start with the Shapeshifters. The Shapeshifters, let's go with this one, the Blood Moon Staff. I'm actually going to put that to like barely usable plus. The Shapeshifter staffs have always been really popular and really strong in a lot of contents. In Stalker Corrupted Dungeons, I think the cost of this is a little too high, and the counters to it is just too many. Too many to counter. Like, I'm just thinking the Fire Staff. Fire Staff with the Firewall just destroys this really, really easily. So I'm gonna put that in barely usable plus. You can still use it. You have to practice a lot. It's just not there. This Golem, just don't use it. It's good for small scale. It's good for ZVZ, but not for Stalker Corrupted Dungeons. Just don't use it. The Imp, I would actually go with the Imp as the alternative meta. It is, again, expensive for Stalker Corrupted Dungeon itself, but with a little bit of practice, I think you can use it. It is really good against most of the meta that you will see in Stalker Corrupted Dungeons. Especially that double Q in Imp form just deals so much damage. Especially with the polymorph as well. You polymorph double Q into a double Q in your human form and double Q in your Imp form. Really, really good. This one right here, Light Color. Another one that you shouldn't really use. Again, similar to this golem looking thing. It is good for small scale. Really, really good for small scale. But not really for Stalker Corrupted Dungeons. The Bear, the infamous Bear. I'm gonna put that in super meta, ladies and gents. The Bear has always been, ever since people figured out that the Bear's Roar and the bear stun, especially when it is half health, is just so powerful. It just can turn the tide, especially with the puddles on the human form W. It is actually super, super good. I would put that in super meta because it really is. The Panther. Ooh, the Panther. I'm gonna put the Panther in the alternative meta. I think the Panther, ooh, maybe barely usable. It's almost the same as this. Slightly better though. Slightly better than... I don't know if it's the same as... It's in between. It's in between. So I'm gonna put it just here. I'll put it in the alternative meta. It is really good as well for cheesing. It is incredible if you can get a pounce on your opponent. Haha, literal. Pounce on your opponent when you're invis. It could be an alternative meta right there. I think I like that. I think I like that. This tree is to not use as well. Similar with all of the other explanations here, you want to use these for small scales, not really for Stalker Corrupted Dungeons. Let's move on to the Arcanes. Those are the shapeshifters. Bears the meta right there. Arcanes, let's just put all of these. Even Song, don't use. Great Arcane, don't use. Occult Staff, don't use. They are not for Corrupted Dungeons. This one, the Cleanser, don't use. Enigmatic, don't use. Don't use any of them. There should be a couple more Arcanes here. This one as well, don't use. This is the old one-hand Arcane over here. The one-hand Arcane, I would say, is alternative meta. If this is the Great Arcane, or this is the Witchwork, if this is the Witchwork, I would honestly put it like barely usable Witchwork. It's not don't use. It's super difficult to win with, but there are certain builds in this tree that you can win against. So I'm gonna put it barely usable for the Great Arcane. This is the one-hand Arcane. The one-hand Arcane, I would say, is an alternative meta. You see them a lot in Stalker Corrupted Dungeons. Not as much as the super meta, obviously, but it can beat the likes of Trinity Spears with the pre-stacks. It can beat Dual Sword pretty easily because of the Purge. So I'm gonna put that under alternative meta. So all of these though, all of these 5 Arcanes, this is like the easiest to decide. Just don't use any of them. Witchwork can be barely used. One-hand Arcane can it's an alternative meta. Let's move on to the Axe. Start off with the Great Axe. Great Axe. Okay, so we should add a new category called Rat. But I'm gonna just put this. This is for ratting. The Great Axe. It's not barely usable. It's below barely usable. It's not a cheese build. So I'll put it to do not use. It can work though. Honestly, it can work. If you put in a lot of effort into it, you're just susceptible to a lot of reflex. Your spin to win. Mostly these are used for ratting, meaning they just go to Corrupted Dungeons and kill mobs. So I'm gonna put it in don't use. Realm Breaker. I'm gonna put it in don't use as well. It's just too expensive for Stalker Corrupted Dungeons. You don't really get a lot of value out of it. I'm gonna put it in don't use as well. For ratting as well as here, Bear Paws. Again, the price is just a little too high to put it in any of the categories above it. Only used for ratting though. So there's that. I'm gonna go with Carrion Collar. Carrion Collar, I'm gonna actually put it in the barely usable Carrion Collar. This is one of those weapons that you can definitely practice a lot. Use it as like a normal axe ability. Kite a lot with the bleeds and the anti-healing. You can actually use that. Along with the Infernal Scythe. I've seen Infernal Scythe. Infernal Scythe, if you don't know, is basically the axe version of a Bloodletter. If you have 40% or less health, it deals more damage. If you have 40% or more health, it deals less damage. So more damage under 40, less damage above 40, depending on the health of your opponent. So I'm gonna put it under barely usable. Yeah, the cooldown may be a little too long. but it's barely usable. Obviously, these, as mentioned, barely usable, plus and barely usable. This can only work against in the hands of like someone who is really, really good, I would say. For the axe, for the halberd, yeah, I'm gonna put it to don't use. Don't use the halberd for this one. It's not really something that you want to use in Stalker Corrupted Dungeons. For the battle axe, I would go for the alternative meta. It's not quite, right? It's not quite the meta. It's not quite super meta. Battle axe, I would say, is an alternative meta. Your typical battle axe build is your battle axe, either Moisak or Torch, Hunter Hood, Mercenary Jacket, Plate Shoes, Thetford Cape, or Avalonian Cape. It is a really good weapon. It just gets countered a lot by fire, which is true for a lot of melees. But if you know how to kite, you can both kite and brawl with this build. So I'm gonna put it under alternative meta. Okay, let's move on to the bows. Let's start with the do not use. Do not use. Honestly, Mist Piercer, if you're really, really good, you can make it work. Honestly, you can make it. You can make a Mist Piercer work. You can, yeah, if you're really, really that good though. I would go Wailing Bow. Do not use. I would go, yeah, do not use. This is mostly for ZVZs. Don't ever use that. Longbow. I'm actually going to put that to like barely usable plus. Longbows are one of those weapons that is really good in the hands of someone who has perfected it. Like if you have seen Beast 1K like a year ago use Longbow in Corrupted Dungeons, like you would say, wait, Longbows are not supposed to be for Corrupted Dungeons, they're supposed to be ZVZ. And you see him like quick channel the E of the Longbow, and you would say, oh, okay, it does work in the hands of someone who's like really, really good. So I'm gonna put that there. Barely usable. The normal bow. The normal bow is a super meta, ladies and gents. It's a super meta. Bows are one of the most popular weapons in the game for Stalker Corrupted Dungeons, but you will see like two different camps of bow users. Those who just saw the bow video and see on Murder Ledger that it's the top weapon in the game, uses it, tries to learn it. When they're trying to learn it, it's fairly easy to actually kill. But once they master it, once they actually master the kiting, the double mobility on the E, the frost shot, poison arrows, switching poison arrows, deadly shot, and multi-shot, once they master all of it, it's actually one of the toughest weapons to actually defeat. So there's that. We're going to put that there. Whispering Bow. Whispering Bow. I would put that under barely usable. I'm tempted to put it under alternative meta because I do see this a lot. Normal bow is just significantly better. I'll put Whispering Bow in barely usable. War bows though. War bow after the patch, the most recent patch, where they increased the damage of the war bow E. I'm gonna put that under alternative meta. I won't be surprised if people keep on using it and we put it under super meta and maybe dethrone the normal bow. But right now, we're looking at the war bow for alternative meta because of that kiting ability, a lot of damage on the E, and just overall being super, super annoying and super mobile. Along with that, I'm gonna put the Bow of Badon as well in the same category as the war bow. They basically share the same strategy where they just kite you a lot, throw their E, kite you a lot, throw their E, frost shot. That's basically the strategy for Warbow and the Bow of Badon, so they are in this the same alternative meta right there. Ladies and gentle babies, let's move on to the daggers. Let's start with the claws. The claws, I'll put that barely usable. It could be used for cheesing. I'll put it barely usable. I've seen it work with the face scale robe. The third skill of the face scale robe, Demon Cape. It's very difficult to make it work, but if you're that good, I'm gonna go with barely usable there. The Bloodletter, I'm going to put that to barely usable plus. Bloodletter is Mostly used for the mist, and it is known for its mobility, but in Stalker Corrupted Dungeons, you're kind of limited with your mobility inside the dungeon. But it can still work, can absolutely still work if you practice it well, especially with Stalker Helmet. A Stalker Helmet, and potentially like even like Stalker shoes if you're like being really, really aggressive. But obviously, if you're trying to kite, you're most likely going to go with the plate shoes of some kind. Let's go with the Bridled Fury. Don't use that. That's a ZVZ weapon. One-hand dagger. One-hand dagger. I'm gonna put that under barely usable. Again, one of the things about the one-hand dagger is it's fairly easy to counter, especially if you have like Gigantify Potion and like other bursts, Cleric Robe, Hunter Hood. It just easily gets countered. But one-hand dagger in the hands of someone who is an expert could really work. Dagger pair. I'm gonna actually put that under barely usable plus. I have seen dagger pairs with the Puddle Helmet, the Silence Helmet, Assassin Jacket, and maybe Assassin Shoes on the Assassin Shoes ability, or Refreshing Sprint, and they pre-stack, Shadow Edge to you, E, go into Smoke Invis, and then do that again. Gorgeous Paul is like one of the best that I've seen. If Gorgeous Paul did not tell me how to counter that specific build, I probably would have not figured it out. Gorgeous Paul with the dagger pair is just incredibly good. The Death Givers. I'm not going to put that under super meta. I don't think Death Givers is super meta in Stalker Corrupted Dungeons. Maybe in Slayer, but in Stalker Corrupted Dungeons, I'm gonna put that under alternative meta. There's just they're in the same category as this, as the Warbow of the Badon, with the Death Givers. Death Givers, the double E is what makes it super, super strong. You go either with the pre-stack. Pre-stack against fire is actually really nutty. But most of the time you want to go with Sunder Armor, or most likely Sunder Armor. Or if you want more mobility, you do the swipe thing. And for this, Demon Fang, just don't use that. That's a small scale ZVZ weapon. It doesn't belong in Stalker Corrupted Dungeons. Let's go with the swords. Claymore. Whew. Claymore has proven itself to be an alternative meta. It's not yet super meta. It's not yet everyone using it and like everyone's winning, but Claymore, even though they haven't buffed it in a while, only the speed, I think. Only the speed of the Claymore is actually buffed. It could be really, really good in the hands of someone who knows how to use it. As with all of the weapons here. You think it's barely usable? I am thinking of putting it under barely usable, but Claymore, honestly, is not in the same category as this. I would put it like in between alternative meta and barely usable, but if I have to pick, it is definitely alternative meta rather than barely usable plus, along with these weapons. Okay. Kingmaker. I'm gonna actually put it under barely usable. We defined barely usable as weapons that you can win if you are like a master of the weapon. I have been smacked in the face with the Kingmaker because I didn't respect how powerful it actually is. So barely usable. I'll put that under barely usable. Carving Sword. Ooh, this one is a tough one. I would say it's in between barely usable plus and barely usable. I'm gonna put it under barely usable plus just because I think Claymore is better than Carving, in my opinion, and Carving is better than Kingmaker. So I'm gonna put that in between Claymore and Kingmaker. Carving Sword, under barely usable plus, follows the same mindset of if you practice it long enough, you are going to win against specific builds. Fire Staff is not one of them. Dual Swords you can probably beat. If you have enough mobility, you can beat bows easily with your Splitting Slash and your E ability, especially with your Q stacks with your mobility as well. So there's that. I'm gonna put it under barely usable. Broadsword, the one super meta. I'm gonna put it under barely usable along with the Kingmaker. I know some of you might not agree, but this was once the king of Corrupted Dungeons. but no longer the case. I don't think it's better than Claymore. I don't think it's better than Broadsword or the Carving. I think this is under barely usable. I know. That was like the best weapon back then. They did definitely mess up the Broadsword, because the Broadsword can only be used in Stalker and Slayer Corrupted Dungeons back then. It was so powerful though. Let's be honest. It was really powerful, but when they nerfed it, it just disappeared. Gallatin Pair, don't use it. Ooh, here is the deal. We have the dual sword, and I want you guys to weigh in on this, because I don't think it's super meta anymore. It's just dual swords have been overused, that there's just a lot of data on dual swords that is really easy to counter now. I don't think it's under super meta anymore. I would say alternative meta. Back probably like 8 months ago, this probably would have been super meta, but just because there's just so many people using dual swords anymore right now, it's just too easy to counter. A lot of people have basically perfected how you could counter a dual sword. I'll put that alternative meta. Still a pretty good weapon, still really solid, but it's just getting countered like crazy. The entire meta is around killing dual swords. Exactly. That's what I mean about like the data that we all have now against dual swords. Claret Blade, I'm actually going to put that under barely usable as well. It's not a don't use. It's not as good as the Carving Sword. It's under the same category as the Kingmaker Broadsword and Claret Blade. Claret Blade, surprisingly, is good for kiting. If you can pre-stack and like just blast them with your E, this is actually really good. But it is under barely usable, because you have to put in a lot of effort, and there's just also a lot of things that can counter it. Okay, the Claret Blade is there. All right, let's move on to our Quarterstaffs. The Black Monk Staff. Okay, I'm not actually going to put this under don't use, although it's under don't use category. I'm gonna put it in barely usable. The reason is dual swords rely heavily on normal attacks. Bows rely heavily on normal attacks. Daggers, Death Givers rely-ish on normal attacks, right? There is a skill for the Black Monk Staff, or in all of the staffs actually, on the W, to like negate the normal attacks. So I'm actually going to put that specifically, because of the damage reduction as well that you can put out with your E. It is definitely borderline a cheese build, but I'm gonna go with barely usable for this one, just because it can counter all of the normal attacks, especially like Trinity Spears and such. All right, let's move on to the Soul Scythe. The Soul Scythe is definitely a cheese build. This, along with Grail Seeker, along with Double Bladed Staff, these are cheese builds. Cheese builds in a sense that they don't really attack you in a normal way. They rely heavily on traps. They rely on rooting you or stunning you in traps, slowing you down. Demon Cape, they rely on running away, full combo. If it doesn't work, they break, kind of thing. I know a lot of people are going to be offended by this, because this is their like favorite weapon and it's under the cheese category, but it honestly is. It doesn't rely heavily. It does not work like a normal bow, an imp, a carving sword, a blood moon staff. It doesn't work with just fighting. It uses the environment and mobility to try to kill you. It's more of like you making a mistake rather than them winning the fight. Quarterstaff under barely usable as well. It's barely usable. It's just a lot of counters to it. It's borderline another cheese build, but I'm gonna put it under barely usable. Ironclad. Ironclad is the one that throws you away. So this also relies heavily on traps, similar to how the other weapons in this cheese category is. This just don't use this. Staff of Balance, just don't use Staff of Balance in Stalker Corrupted Dungeons. Let's go with the Crossbows. The Crossbow is a cheese build right here, the Energy Shaper. And I've seen it used. It worked against me. It looks fantastic when it actually works. The strategy is using the Graveguard armor with the Hellion Hood, which is the Puddle Smoke, and that into an E. It was actually so glorious. I wasn't even mad when it worked against me. The Energy Shaper, definitely a cheese build. The one-shot crossbow. The one-shot crossbow, I'm actually going to put that under barely usable plus. Barely usable plus because at lower levels in Corrupted Dungeons, you can easily snipe a lot of the new players. So I'll put it under barely usable plus. This should be a category where a sleeping meta. This is a sleeping meta right here. The heavy crossbow is actually so good with that no cast E, 15 seconds cooldown, along with the other benefits of a light crossbow with the exploding bolt, with the caltrops, even with the armor shred, knockback. It's a sleeping meta right now. A lot of players don't know how to use it properly, but I think if there's just one video that showcases the heavy crossbow and how powerful it can actually be, I think it is going to be an alternative meta. I'm going to put it in the alternative meta because it is a sleeping meta right now. This one right here, I don't know what it's called. Weeping Repeater is a ZVZ weapon. Don't use it. Same with this. I am tempted to put it under barely usable, but nah, this is a ZVZ weapon as well. Don't use that. I would put the light crossbow actually as a super meta. Super meta because it's too good right now. With the burst that you can have with your Qs and Ws, the E is auto-targeted, explodes, and not reflected, by the way. Cannot reflect the E of this light crossbow. Super high damage. It's a one-handed weapon. You can use a Moisak or you can use a Mistcaller for it, for the cooldowns. Usually the combo is like Guardian Helmet with your Mage Robe, which is really good. Mage Robe or Cleric Robe, and your Plate Boots and the Martlock Cape. It's actually a super meta. It's very difficult to beat someone who's like good at the light crossbow because they're just going to run circles. Boltcasters. I'm gonna put Boltcasters as a cheese build. The cheese build because they rely heavily on putting you to sleep with the Harvester Cap. Harvester Cap, silence into an E. Definitely one of the most popular cheese builds in Stalker Corrupted Dungeons right now. The Great Curse Staff. I'm gonna put the Great Curse Staff under barely usable plus. It's not quite the meta, but if you practice it well, if you kite really well, it can be super good along with the Demonic Staff. The Demonic Staff with Soldier Helmet and Cultist Robe, super nice actually, super nice. You kite them to death, and yes, you basically just kite them to death. I'm gonna put the Life Curse as well as barely usable plus. It sort of works the same way and behaves the same way as all of these other two. The Damnation Staff, you don't want to use that. Shadow Caller. Some people can make it work. Shadow Caller, barely usable. I won't recommend it to new players, but you can definitely try and practice when you have a lot of time. Shadow Caller can be really good, especially with the Lifesteal E and with the Shred E as well, which is rarely used, but the Shred E could be really nice as well with the Pierce and your Q2, which is the Sickle. A lot of kiting and brawling. You can also go with Q1 and your Grudge on this one for more of a burial playstyle. But yeah, it takes a lot of effort to actually make work. I'm going to put the One Hand Curse under barely usable plus. It's not really a meta. But if we're talking about super low levels, it can creep up to the alternative meta, but nah. It is definitely a barely usable plus weapon. It's too easy to counter with your dodge roll in any of the boots that you have. Doesn't really matter, plate, leather, or cloth. You have dodge roll on your abilities. It's fairly easy to dodge roll One Hand Curse. So there's that. Oh, Curse Staff. Alternative meta. There's a Curse Staff. There's a Curse Staff that we forgot. The Curse Staff for the Great Curse. We're going to put that under alternative meta. Wow, how could I forget about that? Alternative meta because it's actually really good. It's very versatile. You can go Q2 with the Sickle and Armor Pierce. You can go Sickle and the Desecrate. You can also go Q1 with Grudge. It's one of the most versatile, I would say one of the best Curse Staffs for Stalker Corrupted Dungeons, just because of its versatility. You obviously want to go Hunter Hood, Mercenary Shoes, and any Plate Shoes as well. Let's move on to our Holy Staffs. Holy Staffs, this is fairly easy. Do not use a Divine Staff. Do not use a Great Holy Staff. Do not use a Hollow Fall. Do not use a Redemption Staff. Do not use a Fallen Staff for reasons. So we're not going to use all of that. Those are good group healing staffs, but not really for solo. I would go with the Life Touch under Barely Usable. Life Touch and Holy Staff, barely usable. It can definitely work. It's one of the most toxic and one of the most fun weapons to use to just basically annoy your opponents. It's under barely usable because there are so many things that can counter it. It's not yet part of the meta because not enough damage. There's a lot of running away. Life Touch is pretty annoying though because it can cleanse, but it has a channel. This is actually really good. I do have a build for the One Hand Holy. It slaps, but I wouldn't put it in the same category as these ones, as the alternative meta. Okay, let's move on to the hammers, ladies and gents. The dual hammer, the dual blah blah blah. This is actually a barely usable weapon paired with a Gigantify potion as well. It's so nuts. You have so much mobility on your W. You have your armor shred on your Q. On your E, obviously, you become a giant and you just smash the ground multiple times. This could actually work. Tome Hammer, we're going to put that under Cheese build. Cheese build because it has a long stun. It relies heavily on not weapon abilities to deal damage, more of like Demon Cape and traps as well. So it's the same as your other Quarterstaffs here. Hodge, you don't use Hodge. Pole Hammer, it's actually Cheese build as well. Really good Cheese build. You can just, the stun on this is so incredibly long, and it's a ranged stun as well. This is actually really, really good for cheesing. Under the lava specifically, if you can pop an imp, and then you get your opponent to follow you, stun them into an imp, bro, they're just dead. Similarly with the Great Hammer, it's the same concept. It's more mobility, a lot of resetting on this one, but same concept as the other cheese builds. Trap them into the lava and you win. You make a mistake. The normal hammer, you just don't use the normal hammer. It doesn't have enough damage, and it doesn't have like CC the same as the Great Hammer and the Pole Hammer and the Tome Hammer. It's yeah, nah. And also with the Grove Keeper, no, Grove Keepers have slowly but surely fallen out of all of the metas right now. And Grove Keeper, you don't even use it. Don't use it at all. All right, the Fire Staff, ladies and gentle babies. The one thing that you've all been waiting for. Everything is S tier. I'm kidding. All right, let's move on to the Fire Staff. Let's start with the Dawn Song. I would put Dawn Song as barely usable plus. I'm actually going to create a video about the Dawn Song really, really soon. The range on the E on this one is just insane. It is definitely susceptible to reflect, but the range of it just makes it so good. And you don't really know where the Phoenix is coming from until it's super, super late. So I'm put that under barely usable. I'm gonna put Wildfire. Wildfire as well is barely usable. Barely usable plus. Just because how slow the meatball is. It doesn't mean you're not going to win with the Wildfire. It's just that with the current meta right now in Stalker Corrupted Dungeons, with just a lot of running away, hitting your Wildfire E is not the easiest to do. You know what is easy though? Is to recommend the Blazing Staff as a cheese build. The Blazing Staff is just so good with the swap. If you have Morgana Cape with your swap boots, E into yourself, and swap your opponent in with your artillery, with your Q1 and fast Qs. It's such a good cheese build, and in the open worlds, they use it for Incubus Mace and Blazing Staff. Just how much damage it can actually put out is crazy. It's definitely a cheese build though. I'm gonna put the Infernal Staff. I'm thinking about don't use Infernal Staff, but you can definitely use Infernal Staff. I'm gonna put it under don't use. I'm gonna be fair here. Infernal Staff could really be good. It can qualify either barely usable, but like I wouldn't use it. There's just so many more better alternatives than the Infernal Staff. Just don't use Infernal Staff. I can squeeze it in and barely usable there, but yeah, I would say don't use. Brimstone could be used as a cheese build. It's a little bit more difficult. The same concept as your Blazing Staff. You swap them into your Meteor. It's more difficult to execute than the Blazing Staff though. Okay, this may be a controversial opinion here. The Great Fire is actually an alternative meta. Great Fire, I would put under alternative meta. The same with the Heavy Crossbow. It's one of those sleeping metas right now because of how good the Great Fire Staff is. They were recently buffed to make the weapon, the cooldown on the E, 50% cooldown when you hit a certain target. Great Fire, a sleeping meta similar to the Heavy Crossbow. And obviously, there's just no debate. The One-Hand Fire Staff, obviously, is a super meta. There's just no debate at this point. A lot of players have been crying how OP the One-Hand Fire Staff is. In my opinion, it is really, really powerful. There is a counter to it, which is the Trinity Spear, Hunter Hood, Cleric Robe. And the Bear also kind of counters it a little bit. And all of these kind of counters each other, if you think about it. But the One-Hand Fire, with my build of One-Hand Fire, Mistcaller, Hunter Hood, Cleric Robe, Guardian Boots with the Limber Escape, with Pure Mist Snapper, Healing Pots, and Gig Pots, it's super, super strong. It's too strong not to use right now. Okay, let's go with the Frost Staff. One-Hand Frost. I'm going to put that under alternative. Oh, actually, you know what? It's barely usable. That's a One-Hand Frost, right? There's a One-Hand Frost. I wouldn't really put it under alternative meta because the Great Frost is something that I would put under alternative meta. It's also one of the weapons that is being slept on by a lot of players. The Great Frost deals significant damage. It is susceptible to your typical Reflect, but it's just super, super good. The One-Hand Frost is more of like a miss weapon than a Corrupted Dungeon weapon. So I would say, as I put that in the barely usable. We're going to put the Chill Howl under alternative meta as well. Similar with the Great Frost, it deals significant damage. It's got a lot of mobility, obviously, with your Glacial Prison as well. With your Cultist Robe, you go Glacial Prison, Cultist Robe, and you deal damage while they cannot move and while you heal yourself as well. So sort of similar with the Great Frost, but the Great Frost is more of a brawl rather than kites. Everything else, though, just don't use any of the other Frost Staffs. It's not worth it. You choose between the Great Frost or Chill Howl if you're looking for a weapon under the Frost category. The Icicle as well, I forgot. Yeah, just don't use that as well. Okay, let's move on to our spears. The Heron Spear. The Heron Spear, you can convince me that it's barely usable plus barely usable, and you can also put it under cheese build. But I think to put respect on the Heron Spear, because it is actually a really good weapon, I'm gonna put it under barely usable plus. It's not yet quite the meta. It was improved visually, which looks outstanding. It's really, really good. I'll put it under barely usable. It's not yet part of the alternative meta, but I think it's good enough as a standalone weapon to be put in barely usable. It can also be used in cheesing for like trap builds, but not to disrespect the Heron Spear. I'm gonna put it barely usable. The Glaive. The Glaive can actually be used for cheesing. I mean, the Glaive is the one that throws you back. If you can throw your opponents back to any of the traps, it can be really, really funny to watch. It's difficult to execute though, because most of the time they're just used for hooking people back into a territory. But this could actually be a cheese build. I would go with the do not use the Spirit Hunter. One-Hand Spear. One hand spear, I'm gonna put the same as the Heron spear. I don't think it is quite the alternative meta. It's definitely not the super meta. It could be used really, really well. Same with the Heron spear. But I'm gonna go one hand spear. It goes under barely usable. Okay, this one is, I would say, alternative meta. Daybreaker is not a super meta. Not at all. But it is so darn good. The Daybreaker counters the Firestaff. Can counter the normal bow. Can barely, I don't know, it dies with the bear. It can die with this as well, but can counter it. It's like a toss-up. This is also a toss-up. This is a toss-up. I wouldn't really put it under super meta. Not quite yet. It's like barely super meta. It's like right there. Right there. But Daybreaker is a little bit more complicated to use than the super meta. What makes these super metas, they're fairly easy to use. And I don't think the Daybreaker is that easy to actually to use, but it's super effective. Trinity Spear, I'm gonna put it under alternative meta as well. This is a toss-up. Like, is Trinity Spear better than Daybreaker? I think you can make argument for both weapons. I think it's an alternative meta just because it counters Firestaff so hard. It can counter bows as well so hard. It's similar to how Great Fire is like a sleeping meta, but this is more of like they know it's a meta against specific weapons. So I'm gonna go Trinity Spear with the Hunter Hood Cleric Robe specifically. We go with Trinity Spear under alternative meta. Pike, I'm gonna put it under Cheese actually. Under Cheese because it relies heavily on a Demon Cape, stuns you there, and like resets. But honestly, I can put it under barely usable as well. But it is more comfortable. I'm more comfortable putting it under Cheese because it just relies heavily on trapping you more than anything. Last three categories. Let's move on to our gloves. Avalonian gloves. It's in between barely usable plus and alternative meta. I'm gonna put it under alternative meta just because if you know how to use this, you can purge damage, resets, and basically not lose with this one. You can purge with your E. It has knock back, knock up as well. If you're going against fire or frost, you have your counter on your W skill to close the distance. Use your E again, knock up with the purge. The purge on this one is similar to the Daybreaker, which you can't really do anything about. They will purge before they damage, so you can't use Cleric Robe, you can't use Hunter Hood. You can use Soldier Helmet and Cleric Cowl, but anything else that negates or reflects damage, they're just going to purge that. So I'm gonna put that under alternative meta as well. Hellfire Hands, I'm gonna put that under Cheese. It's more of like the Bolt Caster's Cheese build, the Hellfire Hands with the triple Meteor Bounce. You can do that as well. This one, Ursine, I'm not going to do that. Don't use that. This one as well, the Collapse, don't use that. I would say the Battle Bracers actually is barely usable. That's like below like the last that you want to consider. But it honestly is barely usable. A lot of running away. If you can use Assassin Jacket and full, get 40% on your damage, and then use your E. Really, really good. This as well, you don't use that. I don't even know the name of that. Just don't use that. It's good for like clearing. This is, I think, the Gravitational Collapse. It's good for clearing mist dungeons, mist mobs, but don't ever use that. I would honestly put the Brawler Gloves under barely usable plus. Like barely usable plus because with Assassin Hood, Cleric Robe, Assassin Shoes combo, paired with like say a Keeper Cape, it's actually really, really good. It's not as good as the Avalonian Gloves, but we'll put that under barely usable because actually it is actually usable. Let's go with the mace. A mace. All right, heavy mace. I would go heavy mace. Don't use heavy mace. It could be used for cheesing, but just don't use heavy mace. Camland mace, it's for ZVZ. Don't use it. Morningstar, don't use it. One-hand mace. One-hand mace can be used to cheese. One-hand mace with a Stalker Jacket, Demon Cape, stun you into lava, root you into lava, could honestly be used as a cheese build. It's more of like a miss build though, but you can definitely use it for cheese. The maracas. I'm actually going to put maracas on barely usable. Barely usable, not barely usable plus. Barely usable, you can honestly use it for cheesing as well, but with the E, which gives you lifesteal, gives you shield, you can honestly deal significant amount damage, and just because of your lifesteal and because of your shield, you can wear them down. You have all of the mobilities in the world. So yeah, it's definitely barely usable. Bedrock Mace, one of the earliest cheese weapon. One of the earliest cheese weapon. Jason EQMS has made a lot of enemies with this weapon. Bedrock Mace, if you don't know, it's the one just like rips open the ground and throws you off. It's so entertaining to watch though. It's so entertaining to watch. Especially when Jason EQMS does it. Blaze, Incubus Mace, don't use it. Don't use Incubus Mace. Alright, last but definitely not the least, the Nature Staff. I'm gonna put the Great Nature, don't use it. It was last year. If this was last year, this would have been an alternative meta or even a super meta. But they nerfed it to the ground. You no longer get heals with dots, so don't ever use that. The Blight Staff. I am tempted to put it here. Barely usable. I'm not going to put it barely usable plus, not to disrespect any of these weapon lines. It's definitely a barely usable weapon. It's not as effective in Corrupted Dungeons as it is in the Mist, because a lot of the Mist players tend to have longer fights. In Corrupted Dungeons, not so much. They have bursts. So I'm going to put that under barely usable. Rampant Staff, do not use it. It's a ZVZ weapon. The Well, this one, don't use it as well. It's a Wild Staff, I believe. One-Hand Nature, I'll put it, don't use it as well. Don't use the One-Hand Nature, especially the Iron Root. Don't use Iron Root. Just don't actually use the Iron Root. The Druidic Staff, I would honestly put this under barely usable as well. It could be used maybe in between barely usable plus and barely usable. It's definitely above the Blight Staff, but they almost have the same type of playstyle with just a lot of heals, a lot of running away. But I'm going to put the Druidic Staff under barely usable as well. Just because it's not really as effective as the other weapons under barely usable plus. Okay, so that is my list. There are 4 super metas on my list. The Bear, the Bow, the Light Crossbow, and the One-Hand Fire Staff. Like, if you look at Murder Ledger, these are the weapons that have really, really high win rates. It's super good. I recommend using all of this if you are looking to win a lot in Corrupted Dungeons. For the Bear, the typical build is the Primal Staff, Soldier Helmet, Cultist Robe, Plate Shoes, and Carrion Cape, along with either Eel Stew. You want to use Eel Stew. If you want more health, you go Pyramid Snapper, Healing Pots, Gig Pots as an alternative. For your normal bow, you go Normal Bow, Hunter Hood, Mercenary Jacket, any Plate Shoes, Thetford Cape. You also want to go with the Eel Stew, Healing Pots, Gig Pots as well. For your Light Crossbow, the build that you want to use is the Light Crossbow, Moisac, Guardian Helmet, Cleric Robe, any Plate Shoes, Carrion Cape, or if you want to be a more defensive playstyle, Martlock Cape, again with Eel Stew or Pork Omelet in this one. Healing Pots, Gig Pots as an alternative. For your Fire Staff, you want to go Fire Staff, One-Hand Fire Staff, Mist Collar, Hunter Hood, Cleric Robe, Guardian Boots with your Rejuvenating Sprint, Limhurst Cape. I do recommend Pyramid Snapper if you're trying to save on cost on food. You want to go with a Beef Sandwich, along with Healing Potion and Gig Pots as well. So that is my tier list for Stalker Corrupted Dungeons. If you have any thoughts on it, leave it in the comment section below, and let's discuss. Let's do this.